It's exactly 1 p.m. and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the leadership series of the Africa Leadership Initiative West Africa. It's an honor to welcome you all on behalf of the board and the executive leadership of the fellowship. About a year ago, fellows of Ali gathered in Accra to explore the theme, Building to Last Leadership versus Systems. And soon after that very inspiring session, the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. Now, the quick questions we're asking ourselves as we converge virtually today is how do we rise from one of the most difficult years in modern history to not only make progress, but also to thrive? How can leaders make 2021 count to ensure a better organization, a better nation, or a thriving continent? And how do we build on the future starting from here? If truly there is opportunity in the face of disruption, then we better find these opportunities now and move on to attain them in this all-important year. We are very privileged today to have one of Africa's foremost leaders with us to share useful insights on how to successfully navigate the year 2021 to get results. Professor PLO Lumumba is the founder of the PLO Lumumba Foundation and a consultant with Lumumba and Lumumba as advocates, a member of the Africa Justice Group. He's an advocate of the High Courts of Kenya and Tanganyika and a certified mediator. Professor Lumumba is a fellow of the Institute of Certified Public Secretaries of Kenya, a fellow of the Kenya Institute of Management, and honorary fellow of the Africa Academy of Sciences. He's a chairman of the Farafina Investment Group in Monrovia, Liberia, and Economic Strategic Growth and Development Initiative for Africa based in Nigeria. He's also the founder of several organizations, including the PLO Lumumba Foundation, a charitable organization that has been in operation since 1990. Prof has authored several books and also written and given several speeches, and I've been a beneficiary of a number of these insightful presentations outside Africa. He is recognized as one of the leading public speakers in Africa and the diaspora. He has been twice recognized as one of the 100
Sorry, Albert, you were muted, but I believe that you have invited the prof and he can carry on with his speech for the afternoon.
Let me quickly correct that. Sorry about that. I really sorry. So just half a minute that I am welcoming you to the leadership series on behalf of the leadership, the executive board, and the leadership of the Africa Leadership Initiative West Africa. And to introduce Professor Lumumba, who is our guest for today. I've had a privilege of listening to Prof in previous years, sharing on various topics. And our big thesis for today is how do we, as leaders, take advantage of the year 2021 after a most disruptive 2020. My sincere apologies for my muted mic, but Prof, it's our honor to welcome you to the Africa Leadership Initiative West Africa.
So thank you very much for inviting me to what I consider to be a very useful conversation, particularly at this time. Those who are in the business of commentating have described the year 2020 as annus horribilis, and the assumption is that this will be annus mirabilis, the year of miracles. But I want to preface my contribution by saying that in as much as the world is going through a pandemic, there are those who have also described this pandemic as having been exacerbated by infodemics. We live in a world today where a thing happens in Yamoussoukro in La Côte d'Ivoire, and within 1 minute it is heard in Lagos, Nigeria, and in Accra, Ghana. And I think that in and of itself has served to ensure that what we are doing is known to almost each one of us. And that is why people are worried, because the impact of COVID-19 has been monumental. And you yourself were clear in saying that in modern history, the world has never witnessed something like this. But yet there is a sense in which the human spirit throughout the ages has demonstrated that, like the phoenix before it, it rises when it is confronted with adversity. Just this morning, I was rereading a speech that was delivered by a great South African in the month of April 1906. Pixley Kaisa Kaseme is one, or was one, of the founders of the African National Congress. And as a student at the University of Columbia in the United States of America, he delivered a famous speech, The Regeneration of Africa. And in that regeneration of Africa, he was able to catalog the things that Africa needed to do in order to rise from the yoke of colonization. And he's not the only one who has had occasion to deal with such matters. Those of you in Ghana, in Accra, Ghana, will remember the famous James Emmons Kwejiragri and his famous speech about eagles and about the ability of the eagle to rise and soar. And I'll therefore not tell you the story, but make you recognize that it is in times of adversity that indeed the human spirit is capable of demonstrating its resilience. There is the old cliche, it is darkest before dawn, and the stars are brightest when it is darkest. And I hold the view, therefore, that Africa is in a very unique space. It must not be lost on us that during this very year, when we are confronting COVID-19, it is the year that the African Union, with all her failings, has pronounced the commencement of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and the possibility of the deployment of the African passport. So there are many things that are lined up in the constellation of activities which, if they gain traction, will ensure that the continent of Africa is on the right trajectory. But let us also ask ourselves a few fundamental questions, because some of these questions must be seen at the macro level, but they must also be understood at the micro level, and much more fundamentally in a very granular fashion, so that we are not simply giving a broad brush treatment to the issues on the table. Because of COVID-19, the economies of most African countries have been devastated. I do not know of any single country in Africa whose economy has not shrunk. Forget about the statistics from the governments. They'll always try to paint a rosy picture. You only have to have a conversation with your colleagues or to listen to anecdotal evidence. Look at the hospitality industry, devastated. Look at the tourism sector in many African countries, devastated. Look at the manufacturing sector. Look at the aviation sector. Look at the education sector. Look at agriculture. The net effect is that there is not a single industry that has been left unscathed. Of course, there are industries such as the pharmaceuticals are now running all the way to the bank singing Eureka, but those are few and far between, which then begs the question, how can we confront the situation that we face now at several levels? Number one is the global level. And at the global level, one may say, and rightly so, that our contributions are minimal and that therefore we ought not to worry about them too much. Then at the continental level, one will ask, what can we do as a continent in order to ensure that we mitigate the impact of COVID-19? And when we go down below the continental level, we can talk about the regional level. Those of you who are in West Africa will talk about what is it that ECOWAS can do? What is it that SADC can do in Southern Africa? What is it that can be done in the Maghreb? What is it that can be done in Central Africa and within East Africa? And below the regional level, what is it that can be done at the country level? And beyond the country level, we now go to the private sector and the individual sector and the various sectors that then undergird the economies that we are talking about. And that is where the subject that you are grappling with, the subject of leadership, then becomes very relevant in a conversation such as this. In the introductory paper, the aid memoir that you sent to me, you have quoted somebody, Peter Senge, as defining leadership as the ability to produce change. But I think that that is a very pedestrian definition of what leadership is. What change? It must be, leadership must be the ability to produce positive change, because you can bring about change. You can bring about change like Adolf Hitler did. You can bring about change like Mobutu Sese Seko did, or Idi Amin, or Benito Mussolini, or any one of these dictators. When we talk about leadership, we are talking about the ability to midwife change, which is positive, which improves the quality of people's lives. And in Africa, as in most continents, we have this penchant for thinking that the politicians are the leaders. I do not think so. In Africa, politicians are actually misleaders. Indeed, the state of Africa, which is a sorry state in many ways, is courtesy of the men and women that we have given the opportunity to serve us in the political arena. It is only in very few countries that we have men and women in political leadership whom you can say have addressed the plight of their people in the critical areas, the areas of health, the areas of education, the areas of invention and innovation, the provision of energy, and those critical areas that are truly game changers in the day-to-day lives of the people. And therefore, leadership must be understood a little bit more broadly. That is not to downplay the role of politics as the overall overarching leadership that indeed does have an impact and influence on all these others. But ask yourself the very fundamental question. If you are a teacher in the classroom, are you not a leader in that regard? If you are a doctor in the theater, are you not a leader in that regard? If you are a lecturer at the university, are you not a leader in that regard? If we look at leadership in that very granular sense, then we are able to appreciate that we too, who are not in active politics, but participate in the electoral process by voting these individuals, have a civic duty to ensure that those whom we entrust with leadership do so in a manner that is beneficial to us. That is why it is said that democracy requires eternal vigilance of the population. And if the population is not vigilant, they'll be manipulated on the basis of religion. They'll be manipulated in Africa on the basis of ethnicity. They'll be manipulated on the basis of clanism. And the net effect is that you produce countries which are stunted and which cannot preside over the affairs of their nations in a manner that is beneficial to the people. So in a nutshell, I am of the view that COVID-19 has done a number of critical things which I think ought to be taken into account. Number one, for the first time, COVID-19 has given us an opportunity to reflect. This was the single period when all people, whether they are politicians or businessmen, were not traveling outside of their countries, as number one. Number two, during COVID, we recognized that in fact, many of the things that we consider to be very essential in our lives are actually not essential. Number three, we recognize during COVID-19 that indeed we have the ability to do certain things for ourselves. And number four, we recognize that we have the duty to ensure that we collaborate with one another. And number five, we also recognize that many of the solutions to our problems can actually be homegrown. Having recognized these fundamental issues, it has now brought to the fore the things that we ought to do at several levels, even if I'm using the word several levels a little bit frequently. Number one, in our respective countries, it is important that we prioritize what it is that is necessary in order to undergird our desired objects and indeed the things that will influence our lives in a positive manner. We recognize that the ability to feed your population is very important. And I think Africa now does recognize that agriculture, which we have for a long time described as the backbone of our economies, ought to be given its pride of place in our scheme of things. Number two, we recognize that education ought to be given pride of place, and that we now ought to examine the kind of curriculum that we are administering in our institutions of learning. How relevant are they? Number three, we recognize that to depend on other civilizations or other countries is something that we ought not to regard as the only solution to our problems. We also did recognize that there is need for regional and intra-African collaboration, because when we collaborate in that manner, we will then be able to address our problems. Take, for example, in the entire scheme of COVID, we are now talking about vaccines and vaccinations. Africa is the only continent which is looking to Russia, looking to China, looking to Europe and America to provide vaccination. And yet, it is in the country called Madagascar that the Malagasy Institute of Applied Science came up with COVID organic, which we ought to have developed for purposes of curing HIV/AIDS. Why I'm saying it was not developed is because we Africans also suffer from low self-esteem. And you only have to look at how the African intelligentsia are very impressed by the inauguration of Joe Biden. You would think they are Americans. Africans will be worried about Joe Biden, but they are not worried about what is happening in Uganda. They are not worried about what is happening in Ethiopia. They are not worried about what is happening in Central African Republic. They are not worried about what is happening in Mali. They are not worried about what is happening in La Côte d'Ivoire. We also recognize that we Africans suffer from low self-esteem. And until the day that we are able to exercise the ghost of low self-esteem, Africa is going to continue to punch below her weight. Because if you don't believe in yourself, if you don't think that you have the ability and the intellectual wherewithal to achieve the things that you have the inherent capacity to achieve, then you can never be a leader. I was surprised recently in Ghana when the losing side presented their evidence to the American ambassador. I said, how can they possibly do that in the 21st century? How can they possibly do that and claim that we are independent? This belief that the Americans are superior, that the Chinese are superior, is in itself indicative of the fact that we are incapable of leading ourselves. But let me come back as I want to conclude so that we may interact through question and answer. When one talks about leadership, we are talking about the ability in whatever position you are in to influence processes in a manner that will improve the lives, the quality of the lives of the people whom you serve. We talk about servant leadership, and we talk about it in a very cliched manner. But when we talk about servant leadership, we are saying that whatever position you occupy, your primary driving force should be service. so that when you leave a place where you've been given the opportunity and the honor to serve, the quality of those people's lives will have improved for the better in their different dimension. And these are the questions that I want to pose to you who are present here. And because many of you will be working in the African continent, I want to be very specific. One of the problems of we Africans is the misguided belief that we are incapable of achieving certain things. Today, Africa, as Ali Mazrui once famously said, produces what she does not consume and consumes what she does not produce. In the COVID era, the African still buys masks from China. They buy sanitizers from China. They'll be injected with vaccines from China. And we are doing so gleefully. And we are doing so while we have universities in our countries. There's the university at Lagos, there is the university at Legon, there is the university at Nairobi. We have research institutions. Why can't we collaborate and do these things? Why must we import masks from China? Why? These are the questions that you young people must ponder. You young people, some of you are present here. I listened to a Nigerian whom I may not agree with on a number of issues, but I find his thoughts on this particular issue quite insightful. Namdi Okwakanu of Nigeria was saying, when we are in our countries in Africa, you hear Africans saying, we want one of our sons to be the president. We want one of our daughters to be the president. And in the intervening period, you are sending your children and your wives and husbands to New Zealand. And you pose the question, in New Zealand, is your brother the president? Is your tribesman the president? Is it not institutions that underpin, that ensure that you have good telephone services, that you have good electricity services, that you have good public transportation services, that you have good education, that you have good health services? So in conclusion, what I want to urge you who are listening to me here is that everything falls and rises on leadership. I want you, if you have read it or if you have read it, reread it again. Chinua Achebe's little book written in the year 1983, The Trouble with Nigeria. Chinua says, the trouble with Nigeria, and you can simply say Africa, is simply and squarely a problem of leadership at all levels. Ask yourself today, are you a leader? And who is a leader? Leader is an influencer who by dint of his words and by dint of his deeds empowers others who are better than him or her. That is why we say that there is no greater recompense for a teacher than to produce pupils who surpass him. I also want you to read the book written in 1933 by the great American Carter G. Woodson, Miseducation of the Negro. And Carter G. Woodson recognizes, and I agree with him, that what is taught to you and how you relate with what is taught to you is very critical, because if you are miseducated, then there is very little that you can do. The last book that I want you to read is the book written by the Kenyan Ngugi wa Thiong'o, which is Decolonizing the Mind. Decolonize the mind is the standard of the mind of the man, as Martin Luther King Jr. famously said. If your mind is corrupted, then there is nowhere you can go. If your mind is corrupted, there is nothing you can achieve. If your mind is corrupted, then you will always be a follower, not a leader. And you will be a follower in the sense that you will be aping other civilizations and not doing anything that is going to be beneficial to yourself or to your community. I hold the view that out of adversity, there can be prosperity. It has been demonstrated throughout the ages. The Europe that we see today is a Europe that was built on the ashes of the World War II in 1945. And I use the word World War II for ease of understanding. It was essentially a tribal war in Europe. The Japan that you see today is a Japan that rose out of the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Korea that you see, the South Korea that you see, is a South Korea that rose out of the internecine war between the Koreas in 1953. History has demonstrated that adversity is the mother of creativity and innovation, and I have no doubt in my mind that out of the adversity that we have seen in the year 2020, courtesy of COVID-19, which I don't think is going to disappear, we are going to have to learn how to live with it. It gives us an opportunity to be more inward looking, and some of the development that I've seen continentally in terms of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, in terms of having a single passport, in terms of improved trade within the regions, in terms of examining our research institutions, in terms of revamping our education systems, in terms of opening up to ensure that we don't produce primary goods, in terms of enhancing intra-African trade, I hold the view that when I look at the future, I do not have the gift of a Jewish prophet, nor am I a seer, but I can say without fear of contradiction that if we work at it, Africa will realize our potential, and that the year 2021 will be the beginning, and that the year 2021 is essentially, therefore, annus mirabilis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lumumba, sharing very insightful thoughts about leadership. And I'm going to fill, Prof, a couple of questions that have come up for you, but let me take the liberty of, in a minute, saying that you see COVID as a time for reflection, definition, a time to do things for ourselves, a time of collaboration, and a time for homegrown solutions. And you urge us all to prioritize agric education, self-dependence, and regional and intra-African collaboration. You recommend 3 books for our further study. And one is about the trouble with Nigeria. Second one is the miseducation of the Negro. And the third one is the decolonization of the mind. Prof, there are a few questions that I would like to share with you. The first one is from Nikki, who says, Prof, could you advise on how we can use our indigenous knowledge systems to support our education systems, because the factory-like mode of education is not working for us? First question, Prof.
Let me say that part of the problem that we have had with our education across Africa is that the education systems we inherited from the erstwhile colonizers were meant to produce a man or a woman who would think in a particular way. It is Ghana's Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah who said very early on the day when he was the chancellor of the University of Ghana at Legon, and he gave a speech in which he said, among other things, that Africa needs a new man and a new woman, a new man and a new woman who thinks differently, whose desire is to serve with integrity, with innovation. And that person must be a person who is capable of borrowing from different civilizations, but infusing them with knowledge that is specific and particularized to the unique circumstances of Africa. And I believe that if you look at the indigenous knowledge that we have, let me go into the area of pharmaceutics. We are now being told that we will have a vaccine. These vaccines, one is Sputnik from Russia, another one is from China, another one is by Pfizer, another one is from the United States of America. If you go to the forests of Congo, what are our people doing? Those who are in the sciences, how are they collaborating with traditional healers for purposes of coming up with a vaccine that responds to the circumstances of Africa? I can't agree with you more that deliberate effort must now be made. And this is where policy formulation by the political class then becomes very important, for them to recognize that indigenous knowledge is what is going to produce that African man and woman that the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah talked about. but it requires courage. Do I see some African leaders already moving in that direction at the political arena? Yes. I see Tanzania, John Joseph Pombe Magufuli in Tanzania, moving in that direction by saying, we are not going to swallow lock, stock, and barrel or line hook and sinker what the West tells us. I see Paul Kagame in Rwanda doing the same thing. I think to a certain extent, even Nana Dankwa-Addo Akufo-Addo of Ghana has spoken in similar vein. Macky Sall of Senegal, Hage Geingob of Namibia. So there is not a shortage of leaders who are now beginning to think in that direction. But pressure must also come from institutions such as yours. I want to believe that after this conversation, the product of this conversation should not just end on this platform. You've got to come up with a single paper, which paper is then made available to decision makers. Give it to a member of parliament, give it to the Minister for Education, give it to the president, and give it to those who are in ECOWAS. And it is through pressure that you are going to influence processes. You can see, for example, in China, people like Jack Ma. The reason why they have become so important is because they are deploying their money in a manner that cannot be ignored. Aliko Dangote in Nigeria and quite a number of other people in their Bill Gates, who is now troubling the world because he has money. And I am of the view that your duty as young people is to make it clear to those in leadership at various levels that we must revamp our curriculum. We have been, in a manner of speaking, locked down in a cage. And in that cage, we are being fed with chicken feed while we are eagles, as James Eman Kwejir Agri used to say. An eagle will fly, chicken will be eaten by kites. And I have no doubt in my mind that part of our problem is our education system. I want to conclude by asking you to read a book written by a Ghanaian traditional ruler and a former professor at the University of Cape Coast, Nana Kobinan Kesia. Nana Kobinan Kesia has written about the governance in African tradition, the Ghanaian paradigm. Just Google Nana Kobinan Kesia V, who rules out of Takoradi. He is a Western education academic and also a traditional ruler, and believes, and I agree with him, that indeed you can infuse traditional ideas in the so-called modern world and they will become very effective. And that is what some of us keep on preaching about, even if we are not heard at our most eloquent.
Prof, kindly confirm if you have time to take one more question before you sign off, please. Let me fuse the two thoughts you just shared, one about education and one about traditional leadership, and bring you a question from Oloye, who says, what role do traditional leaders and their institutions have to play, if any, in Africa's future governance systems, Prof?
I was reading just the other day the history of Benin in Nigeria. I say this because I always is from Nigeria and others from Nigeria. And if you look at the history of Benin, which Benin at that time was called Ogodomigoro, and you look at the development of the leaders from when Benin was Ogodomigoro, from the leaders of the Ogosi up to the Oba of Benin, do we know that indeed the walls of Benin were bigger than the Great Wall of China? That is indigenous knowledge. If you go to the walls of Monomotapa, there is a sense, therefore, in which it cannot be denied that we have the ability as a people to do certain things in a manner that will be beneficial to us. And if we recognize that reality, then there is no doubt in my mind that we can achieve what we desire and achieve it in a very monumental way. And I'm giving these examples of traditional rulers. If you look at the Ashanti Kingdom, for example, they have a role to play, but that is not to say that the things that were done in the Middle Ages is what they do. Every society does modernize, so that the Alafin of Oyo, or the Oba of Benin, or the chiefs in Ghana, or in other parts of Africa like Malawi and Zambia, they have a role to play. But the most fundamental thing is that when there is traditional rulership, the people's voice must be heard. In other words, we are not just about to reproduce feudal lords. They must know that power springs from the people's will. And I think that that is what we ought to do in modern times, because, and this is what I want to conclude with, look at the land tenure systems. The European came here and commodified land. And land became such an important thing and has become such an important thing for particularly those in the political class, so that people are engaged in primitive accumulation of land to the detriment of the population. But if we use land in a manner that was sensitive to the realities of the society, then you would adopt traditional systems. And in traditional systems, people are governors by dint of authority that is derived from the people. So I have no doubt in my mind that traditional rulers have a role to play in any event. Don't you think that Africa has a problem with these Western style elections? Tell me which country that has held election in the recent past where there is no problem. If it is not Ghana, it is Mali. If it is not Mali, it is Guinea. If it is not Guinea, it's La Côte d'Ivoire. If it is not La Côte d'Ivoire, it is Uganda. If it is not Uganda, it's Kenya. If it is not Kenya, it is Malawi. If it is not Malawi, it's the Democratic Republic of Congo. The time has come that we must examine what we must do in order to improve governance in a manner that is Afrocentric without being merely nostalgic. It can be done, and it must be done.
Afrocentric, but not nostalgic. Prof, it's been an absolute honor, and let me hand over to Ayo to give the vote of thanks as we bring this very insightful discussion to a close. Ayo, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Prof, for that energetic and energizing presentation from your good self. We know that you had to make time to be with us this afternoon, and we do appreciate all the powerful nuggets that you've left with us this afternoon. I think we're leaving with a lot of assignments to do, and be rest assured that we will move this conversation forward. On behalf of the fellows and the board of directors of the Africa Leadership Initiative, West Africa, we thank you once again, Professor Lumumba, for being with us this afternoon. Thank you, and we wish you Godspeed. We thank our guests for their time with us this afternoon. We thank our guests for their time with us also this afternoon. And we have many more programs lined up in the course of the year. Trust us to be in touch with you. Thank you very much, Albert, for being an excellent host this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
We apologize that we couldn't take all the questions because Prof has a tight schedule this afternoon, but I'm sure he's given us food for thought. Thanks, everyone, and I wish you all a good afternoon.